development of Zen in the West is the burgeoning interest in engaged Buddhism, a movement that endeavors to apply Buddhist compassion, i.e., wisdom in action, to social, political, and environmental problems. Traditionally, Buddhism has focused on individual spiritual practice as the most intelligent approach to relieving the suffering of all sentient beings. Engaged Buddhists agree that meditative practices are indispensable, but recognizing that we are also determined by the social and political systems in which we are enmeshed, seek to remedy the ills of those systems by working actively for peace, justice, education, and ecological preservation. Such work advances the cause of liberation, then, even as it follows in the long Western religious tradition of social service. This broader approach to practice is hardly new to Buddhism as a whole, but it does mark a departure from the traditional focus of the Zen school. Granted, even in Zen, the 10 ox-herding pictures shown in the 3 pillars portray the highest stage of realization as entering the marketplace with helping hands, which can easily be interpreted in terms of public service. But though this may be the ideal, the core practice in East Asian Zen has always been silent meditation, usually done in remote locations. Society, or community, meant the monastery, and compassionate activity within its walls benefited others in mainly ineffable ways. The promise of the contemplative life that has characterized Asian Zen is that selfless meditation is, rather than an escape, the most essential way of healing the so-called world that is nothing other than mind. Still, the need for social and political activism has never been more pressing. Never before have systems and institutions held such global power, thus extending the repercussions of human greed, ill will, and delusion to threaten the very biosphere. Ultimately, each Zen practitioner must determine how much time, if any, to dedicate to activist causes. Probably the most significant Western departure from traditional Zen, and the most radical and obvious to our Asian counterparts, is Western Zen's predominantly lay nature. Ever since the time of the Buddha, the turning of the wheel of the Dharma has been the work of monks. Until now. Today there are only a smattering of full-fledged residential Zen training centers in the Western Hemisphere, which leaves such a vast majority of Zen practitioners sitting on their own that it is all but impossible to estimate their number. 5,000? 10,000? 20,000? Only a scant number of Western Zen practitioners have been ordained, and it would appear that the majority of even those monks or priests are married, and more than a few of them with children. Among Western Zen teachers, too, a growing number now have families, thus following the norm for rabbis and Protestant ministers. It is noteworthy that the 3 Pillars of Zen, surely one of the 2 most influential Zen books in the West, the other being Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, presents the teachings of a school of Japanese Zen known for its accessibility to laypersons. Yasuda Nirashi was a priest, though married, and with 5 children, but drew almost exclusively lay students. It is hardly surprising, then, that the 3 Pillars has found such particular resonance in this Western culture in which monasticism calls so few. But the 3 Pillars is only incidentally a tribute to lay Zen and its possibilities. Its real impact on Western Zen was in introducing us to first-hand accounts of enlightenment and its most potent incubator, Sesshin, the traditional Zen seclusion. The Sesshins so evocatively described by Rashi Kapleau gave tens of thousands of readers in the 1960s the vicarious experience of rigorous Japanese Zen monastic training. The fact that half of the awakening accounts from these Sesshins were written by Westerners presented a compelling new model of Buddhist practice. Householder Zen fortified by periodic bursts of monastic-style training. We could hold on to our careers and families and still drink deeply from the wells of a great mystical tradition. It was Zen in a new package, stamped with an American brand name. We could have it all. Or so it seemed. Several decades now into the American experiment with lay Zen, many of us have been sobered by the obstacles inherent in this new strain of Buddhist practice. As a teacher, I hear every week of my students' struggles to find time to do daily zazen while juggling family responsibilities and the demands of work. And they must do this while immersed in what is arguably the most restless, acquisitive, market-driven society the world has ever known. Like everyone else, the contemporary Zen student must daily navigate through a howling gale of information and images in the form of advertising, popular entertainment, and news. To maintain a centered, stabilized mind under such conditions would be demanding enough even with the support of a close-knit community. But householder Zen in our decidedly non-Buddhist culture is still usually a solitary voyage, in which family and friends are apt to be uncomprehending if not critical of one's efforts. Furthermore, even when the aspirant has a Zen teacher, chances still are that they are not close enough to see each other with much frequency, so that their contact, if any, is limited to mail or phone. This far-flung arrangement is a radical departure from that of the monastic communities in which Zen practice has been nurtured over the centuries in Asia. Given the choppy currents of worldly responsibilities that modern Zen students struggle with on a daily basis, the hectic pace of life and its diversions, it is no wonder that so many are drawn to sesshin, usually at the cost of vacation time. In fact, for many Western practitioners of Zen, the periodic retreat becomes a refuge to which they feel compelled to return, again and again, for spiritual rejuvenation. It is also the only exposure many ever have to actual Zen training, which is to be distinguished from ordinary Zen practice. The latter includes everyone who sits on a regular basis, which most Westerners still do at home. Zen training, on the other hand, is Zen practice undertaken, for longer or shorter periods of time, at a residential facility under the guidance of others. Since most Zen practitioners in the West are householders, sesshin becomes their sole link to the monastic tradition in which Zen has historically been embedded. Given the significant cultural differences between Asians and Westerners, some readers may wonder how contemporary Western sesshins compare to those described in the 3 pillars of Zen. In structure, sesshins at the Rochester Zen Center are much like those of our Asian ancestors. Yasuda Nirashi used to say that sesshin consisted of 3 main elements: zazen, taisho, and dokusan, and the same holds true of those conducted at our centers. Each day there are some 10 hours of formal sittings, which are timed and monitored by senior students and interspersed with brief periods of group kinhin. Walking meditation. This is the basic sesshin fabric within which taisho and dokusan take place, and through which they come to life. As monastic as our sesshins remain in style, like those in the 3 pillars, they draw almost exclusively lay people. A typical 7-day sesshin includes, in addition to a dozen or so Zen Center residential staff in training, the same business and professional men and women, artists, and housewives whose kensho accounts are recorded in the 3 pillars, but also retailers, contractors, writers, computer workers, farmers, secretaries, scientists, gardeners, librarians, nurses, realtors, administrators, craftsmen, students, and musicians. About half come from the Rochester area, and the rest from elsewhere in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe, and other parts of the world. Upon arriving, participants find everything arranged for them. A bedroom, shared with up to 8 others. A job assignment for the daily hour of manual work, and an assigned seat in the zendo. As at Hoswinji, the monastery, described in the 3 pillars, where Philip Kapleau trained. In the opening ceremony that evening they are reminded of the 2 most important guidelines: complete silence and eyes lowered at all times everywhere on the premises. These 2 elements alone go a long way toward helping participants settle the mind and reach deeper states of absorption. So, too, does the rule of not moving during formal sitting, as refraining from fidgeting or scratching does much to brace one's commitment to single-minded concentration on the breath or koan. Little orientation is necessary at these longer sesshins because everyone accepted will already have attended a sesshin of 2 or 4 days at the Zen Center to prove their seriousness and stamina. Still, the demands of the sesshin that are described in the 3 pillars of Zen can be equally daunting here. Buddhism's classic 5 hindrances to practice: desire, aversion, restlessness, boredom, and doubt, are timeless and universal challenges that easily provoke the urge to bolt. For this reason, all participants are required to sign a pledge to complete the sesshin. Only rarely does anyone leave without having fulfilled this crucial commitment to persevere through the obstacles that are inevitable in intensive and sustained zazen. Dokusan is given 3 times a day in sesshin. As in Japan, it is offered on a first-come, first-served basis, and due to demand, not everyone can expect to get in every time. In the formative years of the center, when most of us were in our 20s, the tumultuous dokusan rush was a standard feature of the sesshin drama. In the same samurai spirit, the heavy use of the kyosaku was sustained throughout the week, as were the other pressure cooker methods described in the 3 pillars. But over time the tone of sesshin has changed in step with the maturation of the sangha. Some of the younger, usually male, participants still tend to get stirred up in the zendo at times, but the major key is now one of vibrant stillness. What occurs in dokusan itself is much the same at our sesshins as that recounted in the 3 pillars. One hindrance Westerners face that is not noted in those pages, however, is one that other teachers and I have come to see through years of close work with many students. A tendency, seemingly most pronounced in Americans, toward negative self-judgment. One American Buddhist teacher has referred to it as self-hatred, another as the inner critical voice. It is not just a sense of lack, or an awareness of one's faults, but an abiding conviction, deep inside, that there is something wrong with oneself. The self-excavation process of serious meditation will expose it eventually, but in the intimacy of dokusan it is often revealed to the teacher before the student sees it. This core sense of unworthiness would seem to be an outgrowth of our Western notion of the autonomous self. In discussions at East-West conferences, Asian teachers have been unable to grasp what we meant by it. It can be seen as the underside of the American celebration of self, or even the shadow cast by our Judeo-Christian God concept. It may be masked by grandiosity or self-confidence, but peel away enough layers and, more often than not, there it is. Like all concepts, the Western negative self-image has no substance, and thus no abiding reality. But it still undermines one's faith in the true self, and together with other cultural biases can create a thicket of concepts about Zen practice and attainment. Having absorbed the American ideals of freedom and equality, and the message that we can become whatever we want, we aspire to realize the enlightenment that is our birthright. So far, so good. But when we don't succeed at Zen as quickly as we'd like to, or as others we know may have, this failure reinforces the illusion of the fatally flawed self. At this point some practitioners may give way to resignation, while salvaging their self-esteem by slipping into Buji Zen. The stance that to speak of becoming enlightened is a contradiction in terms since we are all innately enlightened. Rashi Kapleau warns against this philosophical dodge. A denial of the validity of the enlightenment experience. In the 3 pillars, but Buji Zen is beginning to spread in the West. It should be exposed for what it is. A loss of faith in one's potential for realization. Buji Zen and other mental complications related to success and failure also trouble Asian practitioners. But the more tightly knotted American sense of self tends to further crystallize these issues for us. Estrangement from classical Buddhist concepts like rebirth and karma, which set liberation and causation in a vast and complex frame, may also intensify self-blame for American students, leading them to identify with a particularly narrow sense of self and time, and to see their failures as definitive. Until students directly realize that there is no core person, either good or bad, inside, dokusan will tend to highlight this mental reflex of self-judgment in the student's mind. Consciously or unconsciously, the teacher sits in the dokusan room waiting in judgment, reflecting back to the student the naked fact of falling short in practice and attainment. Thus the issue of when to go to dokusan and how to use it is probably the single most problematic for the Western student, at least in the beginning. Whatever self-concerns one may have about performance and the approval or disapproval of the teacher will tend to rear their heads before, during, and after dokusan. Accordingly, dokusan is an arena of psychological ferment that is rich in its potential for personal transformation. At spiritual training centers the world over, few elements of the daily routine can compete in importance with meals. All meals served at the Zen Center, both in and out of sesshin, are vegetarian, in keeping with the ancient Buddhist custom of avoiding complicity in the slaughter of other creatures. 2 of the 3 meals each day are taken formally, in silence except for the traditional meal chants. Due to crowded conditions we kneel on the floor at low tables. As is widely done in Japan, but plans for a new country retreat complex now under construction near Rochester provide for a dining room with chairs at tables, which are the norm at Chinese and Korean Zen.